too far away. I can't cast them yet. I need to get closer. Not still recharging. Need more rage. Not enough fuel. Need more rage. Not ready yet. Ready. Rage.
Managing editor of Crypto.
Well, as you point out, lots of people have experienced this. There is certainly, at a very minimum, there's a lot of people in like the broader crypto space who really resent the media and how it's portrayed and all this stuff. But there is certainly also a sub-faction.
If you want to
most
listen,
notably,
I'm playing a
the
podcast.
Bitcoin maxis, the maximalists, the
what
laser
kind of
eyes,
podcast?
people who only eat steak.
I'm actually going
people like that. We've
that's
written
good
about
cut,
them. But you know, to your point, like the inflation narrative is kind of totally blown up. Like you were right.
Well,
Because we have high inflation now, and
well-
Bitcoin is not held up well.
so I mean, we can just talk about how terrible Bitcoin maxis are for an hour. I would love that. But I think this gets to a really important point about Bitcoin, which
Yeah.
is like, is it a cultural
Yes.
movement about creating a new type of currency that is outside the power or authority of, you know, traditional figures like governments and central banks? Or is it about the underlying technology actually enabling you to do something different? And I think at the moment you really see crypto split between those two camps.
Yeah, is it a technology? Is it a money? Is it a culture? I think, you know, it's hard to separate. There is a Bitcoin culture, and maybe that's the reason this thing that's sort of just made up is worth so much. But anyway, we all know we all know the sort of like these questions, the Bitcoin maxis, what it's like to talk about them on Twitter, all that stuff. That being said, today we're going to be speaking with a longtime Bitcoiner who has now earned the ire of many of the same laser-eyed plebs that you have.
Hey,
And then
welcome to the club is all I can say.
All right, let's just kick it off. We're going to be speaking with Nick Carter. He's a general partner in Castle Island Ventures. Nick, thank you so much for coming on Oddlots.
Hello, Joe and Tracy. I'm honored to be here. This is my favorite podcast.
Brant,
I wish it was under more auspicious circumstances.
So, Gavin Anderson,
I didn't see
Mike
it.
Hearn, and
It's
now
in
Nick
party
Carter.
chat.
Why
I'm
did
not
you
in the
rage
party.
quit Bitcoin?
Oh.
I didn't quit. To be
my
clear,
warrior,
I don't think I deserve that
DMA.
comparison because I didn't try and change Bitcoin in any way. But yeah, I'm.
Well, let's back up because you are, I think, one of the most prominent Bitcoin investors, Bitcoin advocates. I think
I
at
have
one
something
point
better.
you yourself may have had laser
Yeah,
eyes
I'm
on
good.
your
I'll get
Twitter
something
profile. Longtime investor in Bitcoin-related companies, and now a bunch of them hate you. So why don't you back up? Like, what do you do, and why are they mad at you?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for context, I co-founded a venture firm that invests in all across the crypto industry. This is actually becomes part of the story later. I identify as a Bitcoiner. I think Bitcoin is important and good, and my work over the last 5 years is focused on really advocating for Bitcoin and, putting my resources to work wherever they were in support of Bitcoin specifically. And then my fund, there was maybe a bit of a contradiction there in the eyes of some because my fund, which I started with Matt Walsh in 2018, invests all across the crypto industry, primarily sort of crypto financial infrastructure, we call it, which is pretty, boring stuff for the most
I'm
part.
gonna make some.
Basically making the
food.
sort of underlying plumbing work better and connecting crypto to sort of the fiat system and so on. And then that tension finally sort of broke in the last couple of weeks when the Bitcoiners, I guess, realized, I don't know, had they never looked at my fund's website or what, but they kind of realized that I don't exclusively invest in Bitcoin stuff. And kind of a pylon began, and then I took the opportunity to clarify, I'm personally a Bitcoiner, but I'm not like one of the orthodox hardliners. I don't think it's immoral to, invest in other blockchains. And that kicked off this enormous sort of brouhaha, which I think people must be extremely bored because I don't see why it's such a big deal, to be honest.
I have a ton of questions, but maybe just to begin with, I would like to get your thoughts on why this happened now. Because as you say, you've been investing in a variety of crypto ventures for many years. Why do you think the
Hopefully they
outpouring
come back
of
for the
anger, the pylon,
Hopefully they come
happened
back for the
this time
food.
around?
Well, yeah, it's a weird one because anyone that really knows me knows that I have made, I've been promoting my views on all kinds of topics, whether not just Bitcoin stuff, for a while now, whether it's DeFi or stable coins or anything like that. And so they know that I'm a pluralist. I mean, the company I co-founded, Coinmetrics, that's been around since 2017, runs nodes for dozens and dozens of blockchains. So if you knew the smallest thing about me, you'd know that I don't just, consider it a sin to build on other blockchains or run other nodes. I think really what happened is, obviously Bitcoin has drawn down from whatever, 69,000 to, I don't know where it is today exactly, 20,000. People want scapegoats. A lot of the sort of core premises of the Bitcoin ideology have been undone. Frankly, I think there's been a real collision with reality, like whether it's the stock to flow model, the halving thesis, these folk economic ideas. For instance, Bitcoin always, the cycle low is always higher than the previous cycle high. A lot of these concepts, Bitcoin becoming the reserve currency within
Coin
crypto,
serving as a great inflation hedge.
Right, the inflation hedge. I mean, that it's undeniable that hasn't really occurred, and so a lot of these core premises and ideas were basically falsified or significantly challenged by real world events. The like cycle was much smaller in magnitude than prior cycles were, and I think people are just really upset and kind of on the hunt for scapegoats. And then I was sort of the perfect one. Previously, people have this like perverse you guys know that movie like The Wicker Man, where to ensure the good harvest you have to sort of sacrifice someone basically.
But you've been sacrificed
so-
on the altar of crypto gains.
So if you look at the previous rage quits, like high profile ones, I'm not saying I rage quit, but my current, those were sort of historically at the bottoms of previous cycles. And so I think people are actually looking for that, looking for rage quits.
Thank you, Nick Carter, for your service. So you wrote this article, or after you made the investment, and it seemed interesting
probably.
as a sort of like related to signing into a various services with your Ethereum wallet. And we'll talk about that because I do think that's interesting stuff. People freaked out at the investment, and then you sort of wrote this. Again, I know you're still a Bitcoiner, you didn't divorce, but there's sort of like, what, there really is this toxic element. And you point out it's like, there's a lot Bitcoin, and Tracy brought this up at the beginning. Is it a culture? Is it a technology? You're like, Bitcoin is not your like steak dinners that you like hang around with like your fellow laser eyes. But that being said, like I think of you as also to some extent an advocate for Bitcoin culture, and like, you know, like you rail against seed oils and you think that something really bad happened in 1971. And I think you're really, you know, lifting weights, not worshiping false meat.
Bitcoin
stuff.
maxi adjacent.
Yeah,
Learned
so
a
like,
battle elixir.
do you think like you
Can I do
contributed
anything with
to
that?
this idea that in addition to maybe being a money or a technology, that there is also like this sort of like
Requires
hardline
alchemy
culture
90.
associated with owning the coins?
Yeah, and I mean that culture undeniably exists. Whether it's, you know, kind of a joke, like a lot of the stuff you mentioned is like a little silly, and you sort of like lean into it, and also because it just sort of perplexes outsiders, and right, that's like kind of the point, is to, you know, build up this edifice. It's like sort of not clear if it's ironic or sincere, right? I mean, it's classic internet culture stuff,
Wait, why
right?
is that? Why is that the point though? Because Bitcoin, like, it's all about the network effect. Why would you want to alienate
it's a good question.
outsiders? Sorry.
Yeah, I would. That's a good question. I think it's easier to unite against like outsider voices, whether it's like mainstream economists or the MSM, right? The,
Yeah.
the dreaded MSM.
Into the pan.
It's sort of hard to penetrate the culture,
Weird.
right? If there's this veil of irony coating everything, right? It's not clear if they're sincere, and so then from the inside, you can sort of like mock these people when they sort of engage with your ideas because it's like they're not part of the joke. And I would say that's just like a classic defense tactic. And so you sort of embrace like, you know, deliberately absurd ideas to maybe give like air cover to maybe more serious ones.
So what about the idea that this sort of like hardline maxi culture has, at least in the past, served Bitcoin well during periods in which entities were trying to sort of change the code? And of course, I'm thinking most prominently about the block size war in 2016 and 2017, where there was a bid by some, largely more, I would say, more corporate influence, to change the code
Jack
to
wants to know what you're
expand
doing.
Bitcoin's
He's like
throughput,
watching you from behind
to
the
increase
box.
speed. And I think out of that, there was this sort of like
No,
hardline.
I
I guess
Like,
I forgot there was
fake
weather in this
action
game.
that
'cause
held
now
off
it's
the
raining
change
at Thunder
and
Bluff.
seemed to be benefit. Or
Yeah, it was
that there
raining a few
the
minutes
right
ago.
direction. But that this idea that this sort of culture is beneficial and necessary, even if in the short term it does repel people.
Yeah, I that's a great question. I mean, I think if you go back to that time, and you know, really the block size war started a long time ago, maybe even earlier than 2013, 14 was probably the genesis. I would actually say a lot of the people that were active participants then are not the same participants now. I would say a lot of the people that are the so-called toxi-maxis or like self-appointed defenders of the protocol, like those are actually newer Bitcoiners. So like you have to understand there's churn. And I would say what they're doing is like, and I said this previously, is they're doing kind of like a sort of cargo cult like reenactment of conflicts past. But, you know, there's no real conflict right now. Nobody's really aggressively trying to change Bitcoin in any sort of hostile way. And so the block size war, like I still, you know, come down on the same side. I would support the small block idea. I think that's basically an engineering discussion. And then there's also a meta discussion about how should Bitcoin be changed? What's the most appropriate way to change Bitcoin? And it's still clear to me that the attempt to add bigger blocks to Bitcoin was pretty ham-fisted and definitely very corporate and totally out of step with sort of the actual values of the Bitcoin, the way things had been done beforehand. Whereas, you know, if you now, and so like a lot of people, it's almost like stolen valor a little bit, right? It's like, you know, someone taking to the streets today and like assaulting random people and like claiming lineage to, you know, like their grandfather who fought at Normandy or something like that, right? It's like they're reenacting the conflict from before, like, you know, going through the same motions, but there's no real conflict today. I mean, nobody's trying to change Bitcoin in any way. So it's not clear what they're defending Bitcoin against. So, you know, I think there's like been a bit of a subtle change there.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Global X ETFs. From cell phones to smartwatches, our
going around about you now that, a lot of people are mad at you, is this tweet from 2018 where you said something to the effect of every Bitcoin maximalist you'd met had been friendly and approachable. And now fast forward to 2022, and it seems like you're saying, oh no, there's a lot of toxicity in the community. So maybe you could just give us a definition of what a toxic Bitcoin maximalist is versus your run-of-the-mill Bitcoin maxi.
Yeah, that tweet was true in 2018, to be clear. Maybe I just hadn't met enough, or I'd only met the right ones. But yeah, people were very nice to me. I was still newer to Bitcoin back then. So yeah, I think a lot of the issue here is definitional, because basically Bitcoin maximalism emerged as like an epithet that I think Vitalik Buterin actually coined in a kind of pejorative sense, like saying Bitcoiners were too close-minded and parochial, and that's why he had to make Ethereum. And so a lot of the hatred for the term came from that, I believe. And then some people did embrace it, though, and so then some Bitcoiners started calling themselves maximalists. And the debate now is really confused because nobody has a good definition for it, even though there are people that call themselves this, and there's a whole faction that does. And I think they're skating on that, ambiguity a little bit to try and avoid being pinned down in their beliefs. So I think it's deliberate that they kind of refuse to define it. But I'll define it in two ways. So soft form and hard form. So kind of like reminiscent of the EMH. So soft form Bitcoin maximalism, and I wouldn't say this is toxic, but I think this one's, pretty justifiable, is like, look, Bitcoin is the only blockchain that's kind of worth building on. Blockchains should probably only pertain to moving money around as opposed to non-monetary use cases. Other crypto assets or tokens, they're sort of mostly a waste of time, and there's definitely a lot of scams out there. Stablecoins are probably interesting. This is sort of more adjacent, but maybe they should reside on Bitcoin as opposed to other blockchains. And then, you're probably also pretty skeptical of fractional reserve banking if you subscribe to this ideology. And so it's kind of like a more modern form of gold buggery, I would say. And then the hard form, which I would say is pretty venomous, really. Bitcoin is absolutely the only asset, certainly within the crypto sphere, that is sort of moral and good to own, and other assets are deeply sinful. And, I'm using religious language because I consider this to be a secular religion. It's a secular religion to me. It's very obvious that it is now. They consider altcoins as a tax on Bitcoin. They have a really zero-sum mindset. Maybe that's true. Maybe it is zero-sum. But they consider altcoins as actually a kind of a fiat, like a retaliation of the central bankers. And they think that launch conditions are absolutely paramount. So the origin of the blockchain is very important. And if there's an original sin, like you did an ICO or a pre-mine, that can never be undone. And then they think other blockchains are literal scams, and they'll be explicit about this. There's no other worthy place to build anything other than Bitcoin. Anyone building on other blockchains is sort of being deeply misled. They're being tricked, or they're being cynical. Then there's kind of two competing views within this hard form camp. One is that there's no innovation outside of Bitcoin whatsoever, and that it's all kind of artifice and fraud. And then the other view is that there is some innovation, but it will inevitably collapse back into Bitcoin, and anything good that's done anywhere else will collapse. And then there's all kinds of crazier stuff, which I'm sure the both of you have encountered, which is any asset that is used in a monetary context at all will collapse into Bitcoin when hyper-Bitcoinization occurs. That's, stablecoins are a waste of time because all fiats are going to zero probably imminently. And then there's the lunatic fringe stuff stock to flow dynamics being extremely important. You can even make models. These people tend to think fractional reserve banking is literally fraud, literally fraudulent. And that, other adjacent stuff the hardness of the monetary medium that you're using influences the very nature of society itself. So your time preference and the quality of art and things and food and things like that.
Well, I was going to say, because altcoiners eat seed oils and Bitcoiners don't, right?
I mean, to be clear, I think there actually is a lot of scientific support for my anti-seed oil view, but we're not going to...
So I want to have a real question about soft form Bitcoin maximalism. And I think you're in a really good position to answer this, and you're because you're a pragmatist, but also because you're an investor in this space. But what is the state of building on Bitcoin? And I guess this is something that,
Hey, come here.
you know, the first time I ever like checked out Uniswap and was able to like sign in with a wallet, meaning not setting up an account and not having, I was like, oh my God, this is like really cool. Like, I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but just like the idea of like being able to click and you're in the app seemed like extremely cool to me. And I know that your new controversial investment is kind of related to that, but like, what is the state of other stuff like building on Bitcoin? Like, do you see it? Are people doing it? Does it work? Could you theoretically build like a Uniswap type environment on Bitcoin?
Just to be clear, the Uniswap sign-in, that's on Ethereum, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's two ideas here. One is like DeFi, like the composable infrastructure you would use to do sort of swaps on DeFi, and then there's also the Web3, like sign on with MetaMask. So you definitely couldn't really. I mean, you can do wallet-based sign-on on Bitcoin with something like LN auth. That is doable. Like if you're custodying your keys, then you can. Doesn't matter what blockchain it is, you can definitely use that as a login. With DeFi, the more like that's just a whole ecosystem that hasn't emerged on Bitcoin, and I think it'd be really challenging to rebuild all of that kind of from scratch on Bitcoin. A, because like the underlying programming language is very, very limited, and then B, just because the critical mass is on Ethereum, and that's kind of 5-6 years of development and understanding best practices and building out liquidity and things like that. That's one of the things that, you know, I think it's very valid to be like a Bitcoin only person. I don't even like the term maximalist. I totally hate it, in fact. But we invest in plenty of Bitcoin only startups, like founders that are like, I only want to focus on Bitcoin. I think this is the biggest problem facing the world right now. You know, fix the money, fix the world. And they're very sincere, and we're completely fine with that, right? And they're building custodial tools for Bitcoin, or they're building exchanges or brokerages. You know, even like some stuff you could refer to as smart contracts. Certainly Lightning has revitalized the developer community in Bitcoin. To answer your question, Joe, there's definitely a lot of enthusiasm there. But, you know, Bitcoiners, and so that's a valid perspective completely. But, you know, the hardliners, I would say, are totally, they have to find a way to dismiss what's happening on other blockchains and dismiss the fact that Ethereum is charging, you know, 50, 100 times more in fees, is earning, you know, 50 times more in sort of blockchain revenue than Bitcoin is. And the critical mass of developers and applications and liquidity and tokens, if you're into that, it really is elsewhere. And that's just a reality that Bitcoiners have to confront. And many of them they have a hard time confronting that.
I think this is kind of the heart of a lot of this disagreement. And Joe, I remember last year you wrote a very, very long and very good piece about this sort of cultural split between Bitcoin and DeFi, and this idea that a lot of Bitcoin supporters or maxis really wanted to preserve the blockchain. They didn't want to tinker with it, you know, don't change anything. It's supposed to be a, you know, immutable, timeless store of value kind of idea versus a lot of the experimentation going on DeFi. So Nick, I'm curious for your view here. Like, why is it that a lot of stuff seems to be built on other types of chains versus Bitcoin? Like, what is the holdback for Bitcoin use cases? Because again, you know, you can argue that there are some use cases and people are doing some interesting stuff, but it definitely seems to be less than what people are doing with other types of technology.
Yeah, I mean, there's just this attitude, and I think it comes down to design philosophy, right? You know, from the Bitcoiner's engineer mindset, you're very risk averse. You want to make sure that the program is truly bug free. You want to apply the same standards of like maybe nuclear engineering or the kind of software you'd put in a plane that really can't fail. You can't have this, you know, because you're dealing with, you know, people's money. That's sort of like the Bitcoin mindset, and that's why Bitcoin itself has this kind of soft fork ideology where you want everybody to opt into changes. You don't want changes to be breaking backwards compatibility with prior, you know, implementations. It's very deliberate and, you know, necessarily slow as a consequence. Bitcoin programming language has this thing called Bitcoin script, which is variant of fourth, I think, and it's very limited. And actually, most of the sort of, they're called opcodes that would have allowed you to do creative things were basically disabled early on because they would have also introduced a lot of bugs. And so that's sort of like the development mindset. Whereas Ethereum, which is really emblematic of sort of like the alternatives. So certainly the smart contract focused ones, they took a deliberately very different attitude, much more aggressive, much more rapid iteration and change, making the base layer much more suitable to build, rich applications. And they also paid dearly for that. I mean, it's much more complex overall. They're still trying to move to proof of stake. There have been many, many hacks. I mean, you can just look down the leaderboard of any of these DeFi exploits. There's dozens and dozens that are above 100 million. It's kind of the way safety regulations are written in blood. DeFi programming best practices are written in hacks. But, a lot of Ethereans will argue that was a good trade-off. I think there's a synthesis possibility. I think Bitcoin maybe did have the right attitude. They focused on monetary hardness above all else, and soundness of the protocol and security and resistance to hacks and inflation bugs and things like that. And then other protocols were kind of free to experiment, innovate, and create a substrate that you could use to build interesting kind of composable infrastructures. And you would never have been able to build modern day DeFi on Bitcoin. That's just the reality of it. I don't think it's the end of the world that Bitcoin doesn't have that built in. I don't think it necessarily needs that. But yeah, I think ultimately this whole thing comes down to design philosophy.
Yeah, I was going to ask, how much of a role does decentralization play in this? Because I've always seen it when it comes to Bitcoin as sort of a strength and a weakness. So on the one hand, if you're trying to design a censorship resistant currency, something that can sit outside of traditional power structures and be relatively safe, then decentralization makes a lot of sense. But if you're trying to do something, more DeFi-like, or build something that people are actually going to use, often it ends up being done on something that is, in some senses, centralized, like Ethereum, something that maybe has a leader who can kind of galvanize a support base and lead people in a particular direction. So how do you view that aspect of it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's pretty paramount. Maybe my views have evolved a little bit. I would say it's maybe less of a binary, decentralized versus wholly centralized. And I'd probably compare these systems along a number of variables. But, with running an Ethereum node, if you compare it to other blockchains, it's actually much more doable, because ultimately I would say decentralization is really a function of how easy it is to run a node and participate as an equal peer on the network. There's a few blockchains that it's virtually impossible, and so they sort of maxed out the node size in order to push a lot of data through the network per unit time. And then other blockchains tried to keep the data overhead low and make it really easy to participate, with Bitcoin being emblematic of that. And so there's a whole spectrum. I think maybe, some Bitcoiners would say, Bitcoin made the right decision. The idea is for anybody on Earth to be able to run a node, maybe even on their smartphone, maybe even with weak internet connection. Clearly there's market demand for an alternative model where you're doing more computation per unit time. Fees are lower because you're pushing more data through the system, and so there's more capacity. But I would say just looking at Ethereum, if you compare it to the Bitcoin design philosophy, Bitcoin embraced this layered model with initially sidechains was a big part of the vision, and then with Lightning as an L2 network. I'd say Ethereum culture is kind of downstream of Bitcoin culture in many ways. They embrace the layered model too. There's many different L2s being built on Ethereum, so they also ended up being more pragmatic in understanding that you can't have the nodes be arbitrarily large. So I would say they actually embrace the same philosophy at the end of the day.
Appalachia was largely built around the coal industry. If coal is dying, then what does that make us?
Bloomberg is helping Brandon build sustainable, greener economies.
Bloomberg has believed in us. Together, we've helped create more than 50 new businesses. They're not just new businesses, they're demonstrating very tangibly what a new economy can look like.
Bloomberg dedicates almost all of its profits to transforming lives around the world. See how at bloomberg.com/facethedata.
The crypto universe is expanding rapidly. And with that expansion comes intense volatility.
Time now for our crypto report.
Bitcoin and Ethereum.
In a rapidly growing crypto space.
The present and future of our financial systems are being fundamentally challenged. I'm Stacey Marie Ishmael, managing editor of crypto for Bloomberg News, and your host for Bloomberg Crypto, a daily Bloomberg iHeart podcast. Join me for a deep dive into how digital financial assets are affecting all our lives. We examine who the players are and what's at stake in this financial upheaval.
But really what crypto and Web3 enables is access.
Each weekday, I talk you through the latest takeaways in crypto. We tackle everything from Bitcoin to Bored Apes. You hear from Bloomberg reporters and editors around the world, as well as experts from every corner of this industry. Together, we explore these shifts in the way we live, our politics, and our culture. I'm Stacey Marie Ishmael, host of Bloomberg Crypto, a daily Bloomberg iHeart podcast. Listen to Bloomberg Crypto on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
So, one of the things that you mentioned in the beginning is a lot of like sort of Bitcoin stories or Bitcoin theses have sort of blown up. And the big one in 2022 is that we have the highest inflation in the US in 40 years, and Bitcoin has not proved to be particularly robust against that. It sort of has been moving in line with the stock market. Another thing that happened in 2022 that I don't think gets as much attention as that is, and one of my interests personally in Bitcoin is this idea of like censorship resistant money. The idea that I could send you or Tracy some money and no third party could tell us no, which I think like in a time where, cash is going away and more commerce is conducted online is potentially a very powerful thing. But the other thing that happened in 2022 is we had the Canadian trucker protests, where a bunch of the participants and donors lost access or had money frozen, lost access to their bank accounts. But it didn't seem like, it seemed like, oh, this is a great moment for Bitcoin in theory, except that I don't think like Bitcoin was that powerful, or that my impression was, it was easy for authorities to track the Bitcoin that were being sent. It was like very public. There was no particularly great way, from as far as I could tell, to coordinate donations. I think a lot of it just ended up like in the hands of someone who, and hopefully they got it to the right people. Like it seemed like that was a failure too. And A, I'm curious like if you agree, and B, if like, okay, it's not a great inflation hedge, and right now it's not really cut out for censorship resistant payments or store of value. Like what exactly is the case for it?
Yeah, that was a sobering moment, I think, the trucker protest for a lot of Bitcoiners, because it basically became clear that there was no platform or application that existed that could facilitate crowdfunding with Bitcoin. And it showed just the tools that were put together were pretty new, and they were very analog, and so it just evidenced kind of a lack of
wow, what are you cooking?
Developer talent or enthusiasm or interest for building these things. Whereas there are good crowdfunding tools in quote-unquote crypto generally, but for the most part they don't concern Bitcoin. So maybe that's kind of a great example, because it shows there's just less in it for a developer building on Bitcoin. That's kind of part of the crowding out effects, I think, that this easy token landscape. And here's where I'm, very sympathetic to the views of Bitcoin. Is there's a landscape, you look at your opportunity costs, and if you're going to build something, you might as well do it in a tokenized way and get your early liquidity, and you can get your exit, or, certainly get some liquidity without bringing a company to IPO. And you can raise money more easily. Maybe you can raise money directly from retail. Obviously, there's like security laws.
You just put the money in a box, and more money comes out of the box with crypto. It seems pretty great. But in all seriousness, and I'm, I want to focus a little bit to that. You do invest in, that's why we're talking non-Bitcoin crypto. But it seems to me like so much of what gets built and what has gotten built over the last this cycle is de facto. There have been a lot of Ponzi schemes. The things that aren't Ponzi schemes, but the Ponzi economics, where mainly the only way to improve value is by more people buying in, and then at some point it goes down when some people want to sell without actually like any real consumer product. And like you've also been pretty critical of sort of like VCs in the broader crypto space for having spent the last several years backing Ponzi schemes.
Yeah, it's a mess. It's a total mess. I mean, it seems like a lot of the quote-unquote financial innovation that's occurred in the broader crypto space has been innovation in creating veiled or Ponzi's, basically, or things that are Ponzi adjacent or have I mean, people talk unironically about Ponzi-nomics. And if you look at the field of token economics or quote-unquote mechanism design, people dress these things up in this whole like advisory firms that'll help you with your tokenomics. It's just basically like, if you look at the actual mechanics, it's a lot of it is Ponzi. It's like, how do you juice returns? How do you tinker with the system a little bit to, you know, make the token price go up? Some of the biggest and you know, virtually all of the VCs in the industry are investing in this stuff. Some of them really do believe in the projects, and that's kind of the curious thing is, you know, they'll like maybe they like convince themselves. Like if you look at the Terra discourse around Terra, a lot of the firms backing Terra, they actually, you know, some of them got out and some of them didn't. Some of them round tripped the position because they started to believe the research they were putting out, where they were kind of justifying the Terra mechanics and thinking like, hey, maybe this can work. But yeah, like, you know, I don't know if I care to list them, but most of the really hyped sort of consumer applications in the crypto space, certainly the ones that involve tokens, a lot of them have very specific Ponzi dynamics, which can be pinpointed, and they're kind of all unwinding now.
Well, there was a certain game that was really popular in the Philippines in last year. It's like, oh, this is providing an economic lifeline, and we had the founder, I'm talking about Axie, on, and it's like, you had to like buy some NFTs, and then they fought, and then you got more, and still like the question was like, yeah, but is the game fun to play? Is there anything point here other than just like trying to win more tokens? And now the price has crashed, and it seems like usage is way down, and it, you know, it still seems like basically there's not much there as far as I can tell beyond the idea that like you'll play if you're making money, but the game isn't that great.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It's really astonishing. And I'm not one to pile on specific projects aggressively or VCs or anything like that, but Axie I had some really negative consequences. I mean, it was super hyped, and, you know, some of the best VC or most, you know, reputable venture firms were investing in the likes of Axie or StepN or Terra, things that ended up having these like genuinely Ponzi-like dynamics. Axie was particularly bad because if you looked at where the player base was, it was in the Philippines, Cuba, Venezuela, places where, you know, relatively poor population, and people had internet connections, and then they could, you know, all of a sudden earn by playing this game. But it's nobody played the game for the sake of the game. They played the game to get the tokens. And of course, you know, as the tokens sold off, the game stopped being worth playing. There were some really perverse dynamics in the Axie situation. I mean, you had a sub-theme that developed where basically Westerners would buy the NFTs that would, you know, the characters that would make you eligible to play the game, and then kind of like lease them out to, you know, local players in, say, the Philippines. And this was euphemistically called the Scholar Program. In my view, it's kind of like a form of digital sharecropping, basically, where the locals playing the game, earning a couple bucks a day, didn't even own the fruits of their labor, basically. They were literally toiling on behalf of like Westerners that had the capital to buy the assets to play the game. And then the worst part is that, you know, ultimately some of these like Filipinos, etc., like got fully bought in. They were persuaded like, oh, this is a great thing. It's a great investment. This can be my livelihood. Quit their jobs. In some cases, bought the in-game property, and then of course it all kind of collapsed and like the property values cratered. And so, you know, you've got like it's all very perverse in my view. You have like Western VCs like waxing lyrical about like the amazing benefits that you know, Axie is bringing to low places, you know, some of the poorer countries in the world. And then like meanwhile the whole thing collapses, and a lot of these folks in said poor countries are left holding the bag. And so like not only is this just like a Ponzi-like system that was like pretty obviously going to fail because like nobody played the game for any reason other than like the token dynamics, it had this like nasty sort of like colonial vibe to it. and I think ended up causing a lot of kind of real world damage to people that couldn't really afford it.
It is very dystopian, isn't it? Like these people sort of toiling away on their phones in order to get like tokens back to rich people in advanced economies. But just on the topic of use cases that are not related to Ponzi-nomics, like where are those?
Yeah.
Because I think the thing that makes a lot of people suspicious of crypto as a whole is that we've been told now for over a decade that this is life-changing, world-changing technology, but it feels like people are still trying to force a use case. Like if it was so big, it feels like the use cases should come relatively naturally, but they don't seem to. And I think something you said in your own post recently was, that there just aren't enough Bitcoin specific companies for you to invest in as a VC. And it feels like to some extent, like there are a lot of crypto companies out there that are fundraising and asking for money, but there aren't a lot of necessarily good ones. So where are those good use cases, those good companies, and why does it feel like it's taking so long?
Yeah, I mean, I would carve Bitcoin out here and say, think of it as a latter day, not to like make the pitch to either of you who've heard it a zillion times, but if you think of it as a latter day kind of improved gold with better auditability qualities and better self-custody, and it's cheaper to take physical delivery and so on, then you don't really need that much adjacent infrastructure or applications around it. You need ways for people to store it and hold it and transact with it. But that's kind of it. And so it is naturally constrained, sort of the startup environment for Bitcoin. And that's kind of okay. Like the Bitcoin movement is more about ideology, as you say. And it's like, I call it a revanchist, I don't know if that's how you pronounce that, movement to sort of like take back what we once had, so to speak, in terms of trying to find a way to obliquely regain a gold standard. And so that's sort of like the Bitcoin movement, and there's maybe not that much to invest in aside from custody and exchanges. Sort of in the broader crypto space, which I guess has been rebranded to Web3 for reasons unknown to me, there's definitely a few things which are, really, I don't know why we call it that now, but I'll oblige. Like I am a proponent of stablecoins. I have been for a long time. I think they offer, I think Balaji calls them 100x improvement over fiat. Send an international bank wire and then send a stablecoin, and you'll know what I mean. I think there's clear product market fit there. They are a way to kind of dollarize the world, and there's definitely crypto dollarization occurring out there, especially in emerging markets where maybe your local banking system is questionable and your local currency is inflationary or untrustworthy. So that sector alone, I don't think it needs any justification. It sort of is very useful today. Obviously, there have been failures there, but I'm pretty optimistic about the sector. Assuming we can find a way from a regulatory perspective to treat tokens as equity, right? To sort of bite the bullet and acknowledge that tokens are or should be equity most of the time in a kind of an explicit way. I would say that would be a significant improvement over kind of the default. Like right now, if I wanted to start a company and pay someone in equity, that would be really difficult to do with, or like just some pay a user in equity for contributing some data or something. That'd be very challenging to do probably with traditional structures and tools. If you look at yield farming, don't like the name, but that's basically contributing protocol equity to market makers that are providing liquidity. You could imagine a world where Uber is paying its drivers in Uber stock, maybe as a kicker on top of their normal salary for every mile driven. And you can maybe figure out a way to do that with regular old equity. But that's kind of why people like tokens is one reason. Builders like them because they just give you tons of flexibility in terms of like doling out de facto equity in your thing. So I like that. I also like the transparency you get from, you can go look at any of these DeFi protocols and see the cash flows rolling in real time. I think that's a big enhancement, a big improvement over your quarterly disclosures, right? And so, real-time financial disclosures is really cool. And, I'm very optimistic about that. The startup in question that, really kicked off the whole hullabaloo was a wallet-based authentication login startup, that's another one which is an easy win, which is already, it doesn't really need any defending because it just works. Because basically, if you're using a set of passwords, you're probably using a password manager, which means you are custodying your own sort of cryptographic material. This just sort of formalizes that. It means you can, hold your own online identity self-sovereign, and instead of allowing Google or Facebook to own it, or Apple. And then, it's kind of hard to express in words, and I guess there's probably been a bit of a failure among the VCs that have talked about this. But yeah, the ability to log on with your keys, that to me is like a critical part of flattening the internet topology, of eliminating some of those hierarchies that give Web 2 companies so much power, and restoring a measure of power back to the users. So yeah, I actually think that's that's another sort of key win here.
So I'm actually really into the ease of signing in with that type of wallet, and both Joe and I have experimented with this. I can't remember who sent us our names as like ETH identities.
Oh, I forget. Yeah, I still haven't really claimed my. Yeah.
I feel really bad that I've forgotten who. Well, whatever. It's interesting, and I can totally see the use case for that.
Oh, maybe Mike Demaray.
Yeah,
Rainbow.
that's right.
I think he
It was
preemptively squatted on our .eth so that he could give them to us.
So then,
on the day that we became.
It was
ETH
so
Max.
that the toxic Bitcoin maximalists wouldn't take them and do something nefarious with them. But anyway, we've experimented with that, and I guess my question is, like, I can see the use case for that, but does it justify the amount of money that's flowing into the space? Like, is it a big enough market to justify some of the valuations that have been put on this?
The justification would be that you can actually re-architect the whole internet. And, I maybe that's a little bit questionable. Certainly the amounts of money flowing into crypto, Web3, early stage venture in general, private equity, I think we all agree are probably likely to drive returns down just based on sort of like historical norms. And I think that a lot of that has been a rotation. It's just a function of sort of like institutional allocators rotating into those riskier asset classes. I don't know what the right number is in terms of Web3 investment. But yeah, I mean, like, I think if you wanted to tell yourself the exciting story, you would say, look, the FANG companies are the biggest companies in the world, and they've built those valuations on the back of, building these huge data silos, systems that aren't interoperable, that are hard to leave, that are very sticky, and users kind of stuck in those systems. And they can't, effectively, like, to take a different analysis, you could say these are like digital fiefdoms, whether it's Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, whatever. Like, the shareholders get all the value, and the users that do all the work get nothing. They're the serfs, toiling away in the fields. They don't even own the fruits of their labor. And so then the kind of Web3 story is like, we're going to do a kind of a digital form of enclosure where we're going to, put up a fence, and you're actually going to be able to have your 40 acres and a mule, and, really take ownership of the digital value you're creating. And that's a very appealing story. I believe it to a certain extent. And so part of the
Uh-oh. It's not silly.
Well, we don't have coconut milk, so you don't need just like a hot sour soup.
I love that, babe.
the beginning I am